Welcome back to the Strongman Podcast. Today I'm feeling the pressure because I'm interviewing another podcast host, the one who has done many more interviews than me, so I'm feeling the heat. Tom Davies we've got on the podcast today. Thanks so much, Tom, for giving your time. Can you start just by giving yourself a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me, man. It's really cool to be here. So I host a show. It's called Proper Mental, and it's a show about mental health and mental illness and mental well-being and kind of anything under that mental umbrella, really. And I speak to a guest each week about a different aspect of any of those things. And that can look quite different, really. It can be, sometimes we might drill down into a specific diagnosis, or it might be about, various societal factors that affect our mental health, or it could be about some sort of like practices that people do to take care of themselves, or anything really. Sometimes it's just a conversation. And it's been going for about 4 years, 200 and something episodes and counting. And I'm very proud of it, and I love doing it very, very much.
Wow, yeah, that's quite some run of episodes. If I reach that mark, that would be amazing too. But thanks so much, firstly, for doing that work. I've checked out some of the episodes and they're a really good listen, so I would recommend the listeners to go and check that out as well. I'm going to start with the podcast and let's just consider firstly where that sort of idea came from. Do you have, in my case with the Strongmen Podcast, it's been born out of my own sort of personal story and challenges around struggling with my mental health and in particular suicidal ideation. So I was just wondering, is it a similar case for you, and can you give us a bit of a background into the podcast itself?
Yeah, sure. Very much from that place, as these things tend to be, right? So I had a mental health kind of break. I don't like the word breakdown, but we'll use it, right? Because we have to have words so that we can talk about these things. But mental health breakdown in 2016 after my son was born. That was kind of like a massive trigger for me. And I mean, I now know that I've been struggling with things for a long time before that, definitely since my teens, maybe even before that, but I didn't really have words for it. I didn't know what it was. But my son being born was like the catalyst, really. That's when that's when the foundations really, really shook. And I was very unwell for a long time. I kind of bounced in and out of crisis. I caused a lot of chaos. I did some really bizarre things and, did everything in my power to not get any help and support, which is far too common in men, I think. And eventually, it kind of got to a place where I had to get some help and I had to start doing things differently. I had a lot of time off work, and as part of my recovery strategy, I decided I needed to be a bit more open about what I'd been experiencing. I'd always sort of, I'd not talked about it with anyone. I just kind of disappeared, I just took myself off. And it was amazing, really. I found that I made a conscious decision that if people were like, dude, where have you been? Then I'd, instead of making up an excuse, I'd sort of look them in the eye and say, well, I've had some problems with my mental health, but I'm doing much better. Thank you for asking. And it was amazing to me, the response that I got from that, because I always thought that people would hide from that conversation or people would think differently about me. And the opposite was true, and I'd say that sort of line or a version of it to people, and people would say like, oh, my uncle died by suicide, or like my sister has anxiety, or I'm on medication, and I'd be like in the queue for hot chocolates with my kids in a cafe and be chatting about suicide with someone, and it was just unbelievable for me to know that I wasn't alone in going through these struggles. And I just it became talking about my own experience, but also hearing other people's talk about theirs became really, really important to me. And I felt that there was something in those conversations, and I wanted to kind of recreate that for the me that needed them a couple of years before. I spent a lot of time online trying to find the answers. It'd be like 3 a.m. on Google, trying to find a YouTube video that would explain why I was having such horrible thoughts. And I never really found anything that represented my experience. Not at that time. I mean, the podcasting landscape is very different now, of course, but at that time it was a lot of millionaires trying to get me in an ice bath, basically. A lot of really rich people in black t-shirts telling me that I should just work harder. And there was no working class voices. There was no sort of like depth to it. There was no one that really I connected with. And I thought, well, maybe I could have those conversations, and maybe there'll be someone I'll hear them. And there was never any point to be there was never any plan to be a podcast. I've got a mate who has a mental health charity, and he's been quite open about stuff. And I said to him, well, could we like have some conversations, record them, maybe put them on YouTube? And I had this really romantic idea that someone would like do what I wanted to do and stumble across them at 2 a.m. and find some hope. So yeah, it just started off as this sort of thing, and we just pressed well, we didn't even have mics. We just had like a couple of laptops and just pressed record and just started chatting. And I mean, you can still hear those early ones. They're very scruffy, they're very loose, but there's something in there was good, and it felt good. There was a spark of something, and then slowly that kind of turned into a podcast, and I started reaching out to people. And once you invite someone on and they say yes, there's oh wow, I could actually do this now, right? And then it just snowballed. I just really loved it, and I've just kept doing it. And I think that the only way to get to 200 episodes is just to keep doing episodes, right? It's just run and run and run. And there's been times over the years where I've had a break and or I've got my identity a bit like tangled up in it, and it's caused me some problems, or I've had to step away, and I've decided a couple of times I've quit and it's like, yeah, I'm not doing this anymore, man. But it always just pulls me back. I always really miss it if I have some time off. So so that's a quite rambly version of where it all came from, mate.
No, not at all. That's brilliant. It's given us a proper story behind the podcast and how that all came about. And it's really cool to hear how, and as you've said, it's so often the case, like these personal experiences become like this driving force that is so difficult to kind of just let lie. Like as you say, it's something that keeps you coming back to it constantly, and I recognise that in myself as well. Like. In the work that I do, there've been many ups and downs, but throughout it all, there's always been that, like those thoughts when they've come along, like okay, it's time to maybe consider dropping all of this and moving on to something else. There's always that something that's like pushing me to keep going and keep trying to make a difference in this way. So I can totally relate to that, and it's just a really cool story. I was wondering, just if you were happy to expand a little bit on your personal background. So you talked there about how it was 2016 when you had this sort of mental breakdown. As you say, you don't really like that term, and I agree with that, but it does kind of sum it up quite well. But you, upon reflection, have started to realise that there were a few things that have maybe contributed to that. I was wondering if you would be comfortable maybe sharing a little bit more about that and some of the realisations that you've come to over the years.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I've always been an overthinker. I've always been quite anxious, and I always kind of like, so I was a teenager in the 90s, and it was really sort of like full on lad culture, Loaded magazine, Gallagher Brothers at the top of the charts, like it was really, it wasn't a time when you could be, or I felt that I couldn't be sort of like soft and creative. I went to a high school that was very hard to navigate, and my way of navigating it was kind of just to kind of like lad up, and walk with a bit of a swagger and face things down, and that none of that's really me. I'm quite a gentle soul, and but I kind of I thought that my overthinking and my anxiousness, and I really worried what people thought about me, all the time, and I didn't realize that this was anxiety. I didn't realize that this is actually really common in teenagers. I thought it was like a personality defect. I thought I was a weirdo. And I thought that if anyone found out about this part of me, then I'd be ridiculed. My mates wouldn't want to hang around with me anymore, all these sorts of like very like teenage things. So I hid it. I hid lots of parts of me. I hid the gentle parts. I hid the creative parts. I hid anything that wouldn't be considered like manly or laddie or geezerish, and I did that for a long time. And that, of course, led me to live life in a certain way where I made like unusual choices, right? So it wasn't cool to study and do well at school. So I used to say like, oh yeah, school shit, I'm thick, that isn't for me. So I didn't try very hard. So I didn't do very well. And then so when I came out of school, then like I was really limited of like what I could do, right? So I chose, work that wasn't particularly fulfilling, or, things where I got bored easily. And because I was bored, I couldn't stick it out and I'd get into trouble and, these sorts of things. So it was like a lifetime of I suppose being scared to be my authentic self and to like step into this full version of me and actually take some risks in life. And that just, I had no idea I was doing this really. This was just like a repeating pattern that just, I've unpicked over the years, and that just ran and ran. And, as I got a bit older, I started using drink to cope, and I started smoking to cope and to do all these sorts of things. And I was just kind of going through life in a very much, I had a job I didn't like. I was really, really bored. Rather than admit that, I just watched loads of football and drunk loads of beer and smoked loads of fags and, like out Friday, Saturday, hungover Sunday, eating crappy food, just that type of like mundane life, and really I think it's just a lack of like authenticity, really. That's kind of like how I sum it all up. And and then when my son was born, I think up until that point, I like to describe it as there's been like a little leak in the basement, like there'd just been like a drip coming out of this pipe, and I didn't even know it was dripping because I didn't know you were supposed to check your basement, right? And then when my son was born, it was too much for me to absorb. That's when the pipe burst, the basement flooded, the whole structure started having problems. And it was just the identity shift. I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know how to be me, and then suddenly I was someone's dad. If you're a chronic worrier and overthinker, well, like there's nothing to think about more than a baby, right? I'd had such low self-esteem, such a low opinion of myself, and suddenly I've got to be a dad, and I'm putting all this pressure on myself to be an amazing dad, like straight off the bat. He's like 1 day old, and I was like panicking because I wasn't going to be the best dad in the world, and like, all this pressure on myself, and I started getting really, really stressed, and like really outburst of anger, which I think is really common in men. It's an emotion like we're much more comfortable with displaying anger, I think. So like rather than sadness, rather than fear, rather than admit some of these other things, it was easier for me to just kind of like shout and smash my kitchen up. That was quite a regular occurrence, things like that. And then of course, then you get the guilt around that and the shame because I've acted up. I've displayed behaviours that I'm not proud of. I don't know where they've come from. I don't understand them. I've got no control over them. And then there's the guilt. And then that doubles down on, that feeds back into the low self-esteem, right? So like, you're a piece of shit, you're worthless, I can't believe you've just done that. Oh, you're going to be a terrible dad, worrying, thinking. Every time like someone would have a cuddle with the baby, if it was someone who had kids, I'd be like, they're going to think I'm shit. They're going to, because they know what to do and I don't. It's just all this like rumination. Something just broke. And, you mentioned your own experience earlier, Chris. These things come to a point where you're looking for an escape route, right? You kind of like looking to a point where, you can't think of a solution to these problems. You can't think your way out of it. That you've tried reading all the books in the library and they didn't have any answers. And that's when suicide enters the picture, right? That's when it's like, oh, this is an easy way to solve my problem. I kind of like bounced in and out of that place of crisis a few times. It kind of got to the point where, every time I left the house, my missus would be worrying, is he going to come back type of thing. That went on for a long time. And weirdly, even throughout that, there was still this resistance to kind of change, and I think that's really common with people who experience suicidal ideation. It's like you kind of, I don't know, everything's shit and you hate it, but to change is so scary and you don't know what's on the other side of that change, right? So you don't ask for help because you don't know what that help's going to look like or where it's going to lead. And it's almost like I'm in this place of this awful place. My life is shit, but I know every inch of this shit. So there's some sort of safety within the chaos, and that's kind of where that's where I lived for a long time, and I'd act in these bizarre ways because really what I was doing is I wanted someone to step in and do the work for me. If I acted bizarre enough and if I was mean enough to my wife, then she would step in and she would help me. But she didn't know that I was asking for help. She just thought I was being a dick. So she's thinking like, why is he being like this? Why is he behaving that way? Because if you don't ask for help, no one can help you. Right? It's that fucking simple. People can't read minds, So that went on for a long time. And like I say, eventually it got to the point where things got really, really bad. I started planning what I thought of at the time as like a proper suicide attempt. So all the others had been like, I'd flirted with it, but like this was going to be the one. And I'd kind of like made some space. I'd created, because my family are from Wales. And so I'd kind of, I told my wife I needed some space, I needed some time. I was going to like head down and have some time in Wales. And then my plan was to go, I could say goodbye to my wife and kids because I'd had another baby by this point in amongst all that, in that chaos. And then I was going to, excuse me, mate. And then I was going to drive down to Wales, have a couple of days with my family down there, say goodbye to my mum and dad and my aunties and all this sort of stuff, and then drive back. And when I was driving back, I'd have this little window of opportunity where I'd actually said goodbye to everyone in my life and no one knew where I was, you know? So it was kind of set up perfect. And I'd written this letter to my kids and, you know, all this sort of stuff. I was good to go. So the day before I'd kind of like planned to do it, I went for a walk with my auntie Chris, and we've always been close. She's not loads older than me. We've always got on well. She's like my cool auntie, you know. And she was or she still is a nurse, occupational health nurse in a big factory. Like 500 men work in this factory, right? And her job is to kind of look after them all. So she must have seen something in me. She tried to talk to me about my mental health and my behaviour a few times over the years, and I'd always just kind of, no, I'm just tired, I'm just stressed, you know, just brushed it off. And we had a bit of a chat, and she told me a story about her, something she'd been through, and she never shared that with me before. And it was really powerful because she's like this, you know, she's the loudest, funniest woman in every room she's ever walked into. And the idea that this incredible person with so much confidence and so much life could have struggled, you know, it was like, oh crikey, like that's mad, you know, that really landed with me. And she talked about her experiences with medication and how it had really helped her. And I'd been very, very reluctant up until that point. You know, I would say, I'd do anything except try medication. And I'd written this letter to my kids. And in this letter, I'd written that, you know, Daddy's really sorry. He's tried everything. And it was kind of in that moment, hearing my auntie talk about her experience with medicine, that I thought, you know what? I haven't tried everything. I'm lying. And if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to put my children through it, then it needs to be true. And so I put a pin in it, and I said, right, okay, I'm going to go and try some medication. And if it hasn't worked in 6 weeks, then we're going to revisit this plan, you know? And so I actually phoned my wife while I was still in Wales, and I was like, can you phone the doctor for me? You know, I need help. Yeah, we're gonna try this route. And that was the first time I'd ever even said like I need help. I'd never even like uttered that before. Yeah, and I went back and I started meds, and they worked really well. And I don't advocate for or against medication. That's not really a debate I'm interested in. It's a very personal experience for everyone. But they worked really, really quick. And what it did for me is it allowed me to get to a place where I could start to do some work on myself. It kind of got me to a level point where I could start really committing to therapy. Because I've been in therapy for years at this point, and like just not telling the truth. You know, like I'd get out of my sessions and been like, got away with it again. You know, because I thought the minute I said some of the thoughts in my head out loud, I thought, oh, he's going to have me locked up. My kids are going to get taken off me. You know, I'm self-employed. No one's going to kind of want to work with the mad guy. You know, it was all these things. But yeah, medication kind of it steadied the ship, and it allowed me to kind of start talking properly. And yeah, and that leads into the podcast as well a little bit, really, because I think hearing that conversation, it had such a big impact on me at the time. And if my auntie hadn't have shared that with me, then, you know, who knows? It could have been a whole different thing. You know, it just felt like yeah. So that kind of like that bled into the, you know, why the podcast got started as well, I think.
Yeah, wow, that's an incredibly powerful story. Thanks so much for sharing that. And it just, you've touched on so much that, you know, I can see parallels in my own story, and I'm sure in the stories of thousands of other men as well. You know, you touched on the importance of authenticity, the sort of anger and shame that a lot of us feel as well, and the behaviours that are out of control, the lack of understanding maybe around things like therapy and medication, and yeah, there was so much in there. So thanks so much. It was really insightful and great to hear. And just as you're talking through there, again, as you quite well know and have articulated already, it's just like the stories themselves are so powerful, and it's amazing that it was a story from someone close to you that kind of unlocked all of this for you. So yeah, it's amazing. It kind of comes in a roundabout way, doesn't it? So yeah, thanks so much. That's really, really helpful to know a bit of your background there. Let's move on and consider the podcast itself. So you've had, as you say, over 200 episodes over the years, which is amazing. I don't want it to be like a hierarchical order, if that makes sense, but I'm sure having interviewed hundreds of guests at this stage, there will be some episodes or interviewees that stand out to you most. So do you have episodes or interviewees that do stick out to you, and if so, why?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's one of those. Depending on which day you ask me, I could have a different answer, right? And I think that different episodes have stood out for different reasons at different times, and there have been some that have like landed with me, and sometimes I do think like, have I subconsciously invited this person on because there's like something in their work that I need to hear myself? Like there is times when I don't know what the listeners have got from it, but I've got a hell of a lot, and I suppose a few that jump out really is I interviewed a comedian called Juliet Burton. This is going back quite a while, and Juliet does a lot of comedy and a lot of stage work around her experience with mental illness. And she talked to me about how she would get up on stage and talk about her diagnosis and her experience and all this sort of stuff as a way of avoiding doing the work. And it kind of led to me down this rabbit hole of this whole thing. One of my favorite sayings is that there's a difference between being looked at and being seen. And what I realized in that moment, that it was that I was getting asked to tell my story a lot. I was getting invited to do different things, and I was telling this story, and I was hiding behind it because I could articulate my story really well, and I had words for all these different things, and I could explain it to people. But I wasn't really working on myself. I wasn't being seen. I was being looked at. It's performative. When you're like working with the groups and stuff, Chris, when you're in like personal trainer mode and you're coaching, you're not being seen, you're being looked at, right? And like being seen is when you maybe sit down with those men afterwards and you look each other in the eye and actually talk about what's going on a deeper level, right? That to me was huge, because I kind of realized, I've got work to do, man. I'm avoiding it, and I'm dancing around it by like knowing some good phrases and things like that. So that was quite huge. I was on a therapy break when I did that one, and it sent me back to therapy because you're not done. I was repeating a lot of cycles. I was still really ill when I did the first episode, and then when I thought I wasn't ill anymore, I probably still quite was, but just didn't realise it. So yeah, that kind of got me back into looking at some cycles that I just kept repeating, why I was ending up in the same place. So that was one. Another one that was quite big for me was with a therapist and author called Josh Fletcher. He's on Instagram as Anxiety Josh. He's just brought like a book out. He's flying, and he talked a lot about the people he works with anxiety and how that presents in different ways. And until that point, I kind of I understood the physical feeling of anxiety, and I understood how it got in the way for me and stopped me doing stuff and stopped me living my life to the fullest. But I thought I was doing really well by controlling it. And after speaking to Josh, he kind of made me realize that actually control is actually just an anxiety response, right? So for example, when I was really, really ill, I kind of like full insomnia. I'd be up for days, man, like days and days. And you can see why they use like sleep deprivation when they torture fucking prisoners in war zones and shit, man. It's fucking horrendous. And so I became really, really scared when I was like, quote unquote, well, really, really scared of being tired, because that was a trigger for me in the past. So I had a sleep schedule that would make fucking Huberman proud. Do you know what I mean? Like I was all over this stuff. I'd put naps in my diary, Chris, I'd make sure I napped every day because I was so scared of being tired in case it sent me back to where I'd been. And after doing that episode with Josh, and he was talking about control and how anxiety gets you to control your environment, and you need to like lean into like letting go of this stuff. And that was another one for me. It was like, I'm not free of anxiety. I'm just controlling everything, so I had to start kind of like leaning into, allowing myself to have a cup of coffee after midday and like being tired, and to realize that no, that's fine, like you can be tired, it's part of the human experience to be sometimes tired. So that caused a big shift in how I approached like the life that I was living. So they're two that jump out, and then I suppose there's other ones that for more different reasons that maybe haven't impacted me in that way, not necessarily in learnings, but just stuff that I'm really proud of, or things that have been really like really beautiful moments. I've got a friend called Jay Wheeler, and he's a graffiti artist, and He's very well known around like the Northwest. He sprays a love tag. So if you ever walk around the city of Liverpool, you'll see the word love sneakily tagged in all these like wonderful places. And that's Jay. That's what he does. And his story's incredible. And we recorded an episode in person. It was in his apartment where a lot of like really horrible things happened. And it was about 2 hours long. And it was just this beautiful but savage experience to have that conversation with him, to hold that space, and for him to like take me through his journey and his life. And at times we're both like welling up, and it's just this really beautiful, scary thing. I put that one out in 2 parts because it was so long, and part of it was really, really dark, but without being dark for the sake of it. It was just part of the journey. It was his story, right? We can't shy away from the darkness, because if it was his, if it might be difficult for someone to hear, but it was difficult for him to live. So like, there's no point pulling any punches. So I've always been really proud of that one. It's really something special. It was a real test of my ability to kind of hold a conversation and to keep it moving. So yeah, that one that really means a lot. I had my wife on really early on, and we talked about me being ill from her experience. That one did really, really well. In that we got a lot of emails. Even my wife, people were like messaging my wife and saying stuff to her, and that was a big one for me to hear. Like, I knew I'd upset her. I knew my behaviour wasn't great, but to hear her talk about it from her perspective was like, fucking hell, man, that must have been so horrible, So yeah, there are a couple that really like stand out, that not so much about the learnings, but more that kind of like mean something. Ones that I'm dead proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. They sound brilliant, and I'll have to. I mean, I'm not going to get through all 200 episodes in like a week, but I will. I will have to start making my way through those, and I'll begin with the ones you've mentioned. Definitely, they sound great. So yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. You touched on there kind of like specific learnings. These are the ones that kind of mean a lot to you. I did have a follow-up question, and I the way I kind of I for listeners, I send questions over in advance just so that the interviewee has some time to kind of read through and understand what I'm gonna ask them. I realised I was quite specific. I said, what are the 3 biggest lessons you've taken away from your conversations? Which is maybe, I don't know if that's quite difficult. So I'm going to change the question slightly and just ask you, what are the biggest lessons you've taken away from your conversations over the years?
Yeah, I think there's been a few really. When I first started, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was learning on the job, and as I've gone on, I've learned more. I've done more work on myself, and I look at mental health very, very different now as I did when I started. When I first started, it was very well-being based, because that's like entry level stuff when you start learning about mental health. And I think something that's really changed over the years is thinking about the everyday struggles that go into people struggling with their mental health, like the day-to-day stuff, debt, housing, like poverty in general, and how these things, that because they're normalized by society, how they kind of add up, if you've got a bit of debt going on, maybe you're not getting on with your wife, or you're not able to see your kids every week, maybe you've got a job that's high pressure, then something happens in life, throw in a bit of grief, now that's in the mix. These sorts of things, and mental health gets talked a lot about in like chemical imbalance. And, when I say that I had a breakdown in 2016, at the time, I thought that came out of nowhere. I thought that I'd just gone mad. And it was only when I looked all the way back through my life and I saw all these different things that were at play, And so that's something that's really stood out. And I think it doesn't get talked enough about the societal factors, about poverty, about class. I mean, there's almost as much, if not more, stigma talking about being poor as there is talking about having schizophrenia, and that's something that's really, really important to me, because you can, you have to look at it through that lens. You have to look at it through a societal lens and through a political lens, because you can't just tell people to, jump in an ice bath and do your $2,000 retreat when they're using the food pantry. It's just, there's that huge disconnect of how we advocate for mental health online versus what people in communities are fucking dealing with. And that's something that's really kind of, really gives me, still all the time gives me a lot to think about, like instead of instead of saying like what's wrong with you, it's about asking what's happened to you, or what's happening to you. That kind of makes a lot of sense to me. So that's something that's really really changed. And another thing that is the crossover in struggle. We think when we look at diagnosis, particularly the scary ones, because I think when it comes to stigma, stigma's not, again, depression, anxiety, these things, they're not as stigmatized much anymore. Most people will say on a daily basis, I'm a bit depressed or I'm a bit anxious, but schizophrenia and bipolar and OCD and some of these labels, they're still massively stigmatized against. But when you kind of like dig into the person who's experiencing this thing, because all a label is just a collective term for a group of symptoms, right? And if you dig into those symptoms, there's a real humanness to it. There's so much overlap. It's like all pain is the same. It just displays itself differently. It just comes out differently. And again, when we talk about mental health in this, thinking about the brain chemistry and chemicals, and it feels as if we've got no control. It's just like as if it just goes wrong out of nowhere. And it makes mental illness feel like a bolt on. Like if someone goes mad, then it's like something outside of them. But all mental illness is just like thoughts, feelings, emotions that everybody has. They're just out of control. They're just on steroids. They're just misbehaving there's like crossover between, it's not separate, it's not, schizophrenia isn't one thing, depression isn't one thing. And if you drill down into the human who's experiencing those things, then there's a real humanness to the struggle, and a lot of overlap and a lot of connectiveness. And, they're certainly not as, not as bizarre as people think. It's certainly not as scary as people think, that's kind of, I suppose they're two of the biggest things that have really like leapt out for me.
Aye, absolutely. That's it. Again, it definitely resonates with me what you're saying there, and I think about my own story, and I think you kind of touched on identity a little bit in your story, and that was definitely the case for me. But also was that element of a loss of hope as well, and this feeling of being unique in that, it's just me, and there's something uniquely wrong with me or uniquely wrong with my brain. Like there's and the reason I talk about the loss of hope was when you're in that position of there's something that's uniquely wrong with me that is out of my control. It's to do with brain chemicals and chemistry in my head. Like, what can I do about that? Then you lose your power. You lose the belief that actually I can maybe make changes. I can be proactive about things. You kind of are in this place where you just think, well, that's the way it is, and I'm just going to have to wait. And actually, it's interesting now I think about it, when you touched on like you were almost not intentionally behaving in a way, but hoping that the way that you were behaving, it would kind of highlight to other people like, oh, I need help. Like, that was the case for me as well. It was always like certain behaviors that I was partaking in was partly because I was like, I want somebody to see that I'm struggling here, because I didn't feel like I had the power to do anything about it, and I needed somebody else to come in and actually sort stuff out for me. But that wasn't actually the case, and that's where I think it can be really dangerous when you believe that there's something uniquely wrong with you. You lose that hope, and therefore you lose the belief, and then it can lead down that path of suicidal ideation, which was definitely the case for me as well. So yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying there. Something that you've touched on a little bit there, and it was interesting to hear about, and I hope this is an offhand question. I don't think offhand's the right word. It's one that I hadn't prepped you for, basically. You touched on therapy, and you've mentioned it a couple of times as well. Can you describe, you said about when you first started going, you were kind of withholding. Can you tell us a little bit of your process to get to the point where you've started realising actually what therapy is and what it's for, and how it's actually helped you since?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had so many like misconceptions, media driven misconceptions of what therapy was. I thought it would be very Freudian, and I'd be on like one of them mad leather lying down couches getting questions about me mum and all that sort of stuff, and like Good Will Hunting, my first therapy session, I was like, this guy's going to tell me it's not my fault and give me a hug and we're both going to cry and I'm going to be solved. And actually, before I was working for myself, I used to work for the NHS, and that was when all of this was kind of going on, and I was being odd at work, and they referred me to therapy, and I went to one session. And like I got out of work early, so I was kind of getting paid for me time. And I drove in, the sun was shining. I had like a really good, album playing in the car. And I got in, I met this woman. She was really nice, and we had a bit of a chat. And then she was like, "Oh, when do you want to come back?" I was like, "You know what? I feel great. Like I probably don't need to, I'd been on the waiting list for months, and I just like binned it after one because I thought I was sound. And but it took a while for me to. It's hard to talk about yourself when you've never done it before, right? And like, who has the words for this stuff? Like, no one has I didn't have the words. I didn't have the language. I didn't know what I was experiencing. So how do you talk about something when you don't know what it is? And that took a lot of tapping into, and to be that vulnerable. I was very worried that if I vocalized my thoughts at that time, that I think I mentioned before, that I'd get locked up, that I'd be immediately sectioned. It's really hard to get sections. Do you know what I mean? Unless you're a young black man, it's really hard to get sectioned. But I thought as the minute I opened my mouth, I'd get like instantly locked up. I thought I'd have my kids taken off me and all these things. And once I kind of learned that wasn't going to happen, and I could start to dig around in my experience. But it took a long time. It took a real long time. And, I'm very privileged to be able to do it as well, because not everyone, therapy has been incredible for me. I still do it now, much more just to explore, just to kind of learn about myself and to, make sure that I'm being the best version of me that I can, and I'm showing up for my family and my work in the way that I want to. But back at those times, I was very lucky to be able to do it, because not everyone can, right? Some people end up on a waiting list, and my wife and I, we had some money saved up, and it's called your life savings, and that's kind of what we spent it on. It's like we didn't have a holiday for a couple of years, or we didn't have many days out or whatever, because I was spending it all on therapy. But so yeah, I think that's important when you're talking about therapy. That's important as well, right? Because not everyone gets the opportunity. And I don't know. I had to learn how to do it, and I had to learn how it works, and I had to learn that there's no real answers, and that most of the revelations come after the fact. You stir it all up in that space, and then it's 2 days later you're doing the washing up and staring into space, and something lands, and you need to go and have a lie down. And how hard work it is, and how you can't just talk about it. Like, once you've identified that you're repeating a cycle over and over again, you then have to really work to change it. And that's something that's really hard, is to change your behaviors, is to kind of, make these changes. Because your brain will play tricks on you when it comes to being vulnerable. You'll think you're being vulnerable, and you're not really. You're hiding behind something. And it takes a while to kind of get down into that level where you're being really honest with yourself. And it's all practice. And like I say, it's called the work for a reason, right? Like, no one likes work. Like, it's called doing the work. It's supposed to be hard. But yeah, that, like you said, there's a lot of misconceptions, isn't there, that it's going to be all light and fluffy. And it's not. It's hard going, but it's really worth it.
It's the way I try and kind of frame it, because I'm sure you're aware, when it comes to chatting around therapy, there are a lot of men that will shut down and think like, and I was in this position myself, like, that's not for me, I don't need that. But the way I try and frame it is like, well, when you think about from my background in personal training, like when you go into the gym, you go in knowing that this is going to be hard. Like, I'm going to have to put in the work here. It's going to be a proper strain, and I'm going to leave feeling exhausted. Sometimes I might leave feeling good, but sometimes I'm going to leave feeling like, oh man, I'm absolutely wiped out. And, then you might have DOMs for a couple of days following. So, there might be an after effect as well. But the general trajectory is I am getting fitter. I'm getting physically stronger. And that's how I kind of think about therapy as well as. And the other thing that comes to mind now, just as I'm saying this, is when you think about physical training, there are so many different methods to getting strong or getting fit, and it's the same with therapy. It's not just that one single approach. You're going to have you lying on the couch, you're going to be talking about your childhood and stuff like that, and that might be part of it, maybe, but it's not like that's the one and only methodology for getting mentally healthier and stronger and fitter. So yeah, that's how I try to reframe therapy, and I trust that's helpful for guys, because I know it can be a bit of a stumbling block when they hear about therapy, and those preconceived notions very quickly come up.
Yeah, there's a really lovely analogy, and I suppose just to kind of like tag on to that, I'd say, like, when it comes to training and looking after your physical health, like, don't forget why you do this. Like, go and use it, right? If you're going to get really fit and healthy, go and do loads of cool stuff. Go and like walk up a mountain, or go and run a half marathon, or, use that fitness that you're creating in the gym, go and do it. And it's the same in therapy. Like, you can't just talk about it. Like, every now and again you need to, like, I'd hide in the therapy room. So I'd like talk about it, but I wasn't like actioning anything. I wasn't going out there and making those changes. I was just talking about them. I was like just trapped in the talking phase and hiding behind it. And what I found really useful is to do a chunk. Go and do a few months, then have a few months off. Let it land. Go and try and like put these things into process. Identify these things that you're doing or not doing, and lean into them, and actually like make an effort to go and use the learnings from the therapy space. And I think that's an important thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll maybe I'll tack a wee question onto that then, because it's come up a couple of times both in your story, and again when I reflect on my own, it's also similar. It's that sort of, I don't know if it's unwillingness, but it's resistance maybe to taking action. And I was wondering if I don't know if you want to share your own personal experience, or maybe what you've seen and generally when it comes to men, when it comes to that lack of action, and maybe how do we start taking more ownership and taking those positive steps forward, like you say.
Yeah, it's weirdly, it's been something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I've just interviewed a guy called Dr. Ross Ellenhorn. I think that episode will be coming out in the next few weeks. And he's an expert in change. He's a psychotherapist and like a social worker as well. He's got like a foot in both camps, which is really, really interesting. And he's been studying change for years, and like why we don't change, why we know that we should go for a run or go to the gym and eat a bit more broccoli, but we just can't bring ourselves to do it. And what his research has shown is that all resistance to change comes down to one thing, and that's a fear of hope. Because to hope that something could be different makes you feel really vulnerable, and it puts you in a position where you could fail and it could go wrong. And a lot of people who have tried to change stuff about their life, particularly, exercise is a great example, right? A lot of people who have like struggled and fallen over that horse again and again and again, to dare that it might be different is really painful. To put themselves up and say, I'm going to start like going to the gym and taking care of myself, and then to not do it again is really, really scary. And it doesn't matter what we're trying to change, whether they're massive changes or whether they're seen as smaller change. Change is very rarely small to the individual, right, who's trying to change. But no matter where we are on this scale of change, what it all comes down to is a fear of hope. And I kind of like, that really landed with me. I've been thinking about that a lot, and it's quite a recent recording, and I haven't quite articulated my thoughts around it yet. But with regards to my own story, I didn't know what was next. I was really worried that I was going to get slapped with a label, and if I got this label, then I was going to have to, that would be me for the rest of my life. And then what would happen? What would I didn't know what would happen. Would I have to do some really hard things? Would I have to do some really challenging things? Would I have to start on a medication that turned me into a zombie, or that I was addicted to, that I then couldn't get off? And all these, like, thinking ahead, I didn't know what well looked like. So if you can't see it for yourself, it's very difficult to take steps towards it, so it was kind of a lot of that at play. It's like, what comes next? And your brain will always try and protect you. It's got the human brain has one job, that's to keep you alive. Don't give a shit about anything else. Nothing at all. Anything else is, your brain is like, I'll fix it later. If you're alive, I'm doing my job. It doesn't care about your quality of life. That's not the brain's job, your quality of life. It's just being alive. And I think I touched on it earlier, when everything is shit, but every ounce of that shit, there's a safety in it. There's in some weird way that doesn't make sense. Your brain's trying to protect you, and it actually makes perfect sense, and it's very, very difficult to change and to break that cycle and to step out of it. Because you don't know what's on the other side.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting you should bring that up, because for me, what really helped me understand what was going on with me back when I was struggling with suicidal ideation was that actually it's a protective thing. And on face value, that's quite shocking. It's like, well, how can that make sense? But it's an ultimate protection from the discomfort, the mental discomfort and pain that I'm experiencing. It doesn't seem to rationally make sense, but actually when you consider it, the brain and its protective outlook, then it makes perfect sense. And just kind of understanding that, for me anyway, certainly made a huge difference. And also when you talk about the fear of hope, that's really interesting. I've never really kind of heard that articulated that way before, and I'll have to listen to that episode because it sounds fascinating. But yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. Going to move on. I've got a couple of questions just that I always finish the interview with, and the first one is, what advice would you give to men who are finding themselves in a tough place right now?
That's a really, really hard question, right? Really. So straight, my first instinct is to say, well, ask for help. Because of course it all's got to start by asking for help. Like I said before, people don't know that you need help, despite what you think you might be telling them through your actions and your behaviours and things like this. But when you're in that place, and someone tells you to ask for help, it feels patronising. It feels, it feels like you're being talked down to. It feels like the hardest thing to do. And I think we kind of band around this, talk about your problems. We band around it a little bit too easy. We tell people to talk. We don't tell them how. We don't tell them where. We don't tell them, what to do if they do talk, and it's not received very well. So it's hard, but yes, we do need to ask for help. We do need to talk about things, but it's not always the best advice when people are in it, So it's really, really tricky. I think that, again, it sounds really trite, but the whole "this too shall pass" thing, I think is really important. And once you learn that, you learn if you just hang on for a little bit longer, it'll pass. It always does. It might take, sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes months, but the storm will pass. Unfortunately, you only learn that when a few storms have passed. It's very easy, me saying it. And I suppose I'm being really conscious of that, because these are all things that I would have said when I wasn't well. If you'd have said to me, talk about your feelings, I'd have been, it's all right for you. If you'd have said this too shall pass, or will it? How do you know? And it was very I would have been very on the defensive about it. What people need when they're in it, right? In my experience, when they're really, really in it, and I work in mental health too, right? So I'll work for a community organisation, and you'd be amazed how better people feel when they're just really listened to, when they're really, really listened to. And often as humans, we kind of we listen and wait to speak, so what advice would you offer for someone? We're waiting to offer that advice because we want to help. It comes from a good place. But when you're waiting if someone's disclosing something to you and you're waiting to offer advice, then you're not listening, and a lot of people they don't feel listened to. They don't feel heard. They don't feel seen. And I think sometimes just putting the kettle on and just, sitting with someone through all of it and not being scared of what you hear, and not being, pulling a face when someone says scary words like suicide, and not flinching from these things, and being able to really just sit in that with them and acknowledge it and say nothing else than, that sounds really hard. That sounds really fucking shit, and not having any answers. I think that's powerful. And I don't know how to say that in a way that, to offer advice. I suppose maybe when we're in it, we're the last people that can get ourselves out of it. So maybe it's not down advice for the people who are in it. Maybe we can flip that around, and it's for the people around them, to be better listeners, to check in more, to keep an eye on things. Maybe that's the way to approach it. I don't know. It's really, really hard question. I've got about a million different answers, because my instincts are talk about it, reach out, ask for help. But like I say, it's not that easy, is it? It's not that. Yeah, I mean, you'll know that, Chris. It's if someone asked you to talk, mate, when you were in the depths, I bet you could have given 100 reasons why you personally couldn't, wouldn't, shouldn't. Like, it's really tough, isn't it? But yeah, be kind to yourself, man. Ride it out. Wrap up warm. Do what you need to do to get through, man. Fucking get the duvet, hit the couch, watch some mind-numbing telly, and just fucking ride it out, man. And it'll pass.
Yeah, I like that, and you're absolutely spot on. It's so, I do obviously appreciate a lot of the work that goes into encouraging men to talk, but I recognise that it would have just bounced right back off me back then, because there were so many walls up like this. It was not really even an option on the table at that point. It probably did take me, unfortunately, it probably took things getting worse for me for that option to actually come onto the table at some stage. But you're spot on in that it's really difficult when you're in that place to talk about what's going on with you. It's, if not, it feels like it's impossible. And I also, you talked about how difficult it can be when you're in that headspace as well, to kind of see how things can get better, especially if you've gone through a period of time where things have only seemed to get worse and worse and worse. It can be really difficult, but I totally agree. If you can try and hold on to that little bit of hope, and also just ride it out, just strap in, and keep in mind that it will pass, because both of us are sitting here right now and we are examples of the fact that it does pass. It can get better. But it can be rough, of course.
Yeah, it can be rough, mate. Yeah, and it takes a while, right, to collect evidence to the contrary. That's really important. Like I say, you have to survive a few storms to know that they pass, and it takes a while to learn that. And when you're in it, it's, even though you know it, it's still, I often think that knowing something and feeling something are two different things, right? But so knowing it'll pass. If you're telling yourself you're a piece of shit, like, go and do something nice for someone, go and go and volunteer somewhere, or think about the times you've done nice things. Look for evidence, because if you're doing something nice for someone else, you can't be a piece of shit. These are not things. That is a direct contradiction, so sometimes, like, collecting evidence. And what really a good bit of advice that I got was from a lady called Tasha Danvers. She was an Olympic sprinter. She had a bronze medal, like, back in the day, and she's a survivor of suicide. And something that she said to me, this was like within the first few episodes, and this has always stuck with me. She said, when your brain is poorly, it's not like, that is not a good brain to be looking after you. Like, you're not capable of this stuff when you're in it. So when you're in a good place, put things in place so that when the wheels come off, you just fall into your systems. That, so you don't have to think. You're not responsible for reaching out and talking. Put these things in place when you're well, because you can't trust your brain when you're poorly to make the right decisions. And that's something I've always tried to do, is have these safety nets, have my processes. The first thing, I'm flying these days. This is not something I really have to navigate so much anymore, but in the past, it would always be, if I was feeling a bit down, the first thing I'd do is tell my wife. The first thing I would do is say, like, I think I'm having a really, really, really bad day. And then she would know to take the lead with the kids. I could take a little bit of pressure off. She'd write, cool, we're not expecting to see you today. I'm going to take the kids to the park, have some space, gather your thoughts, and I'd have, like, these little things. I'm a big fan of distracting through, like, I put my favourite film on. Nostalgia's a great, it's a really great distraction method. It's really safe, it's predictable. And I'd be really kind to myself. And, I have all these, like, little things that I would do that would help me through these little storms. And put systems in place when you're well, because you can't trust your brain when it's not well.
Yeah, I again totally spot on in that. I do a workplace presentation, and it's about kind of building resilience, and we talk about how we have these different elements that come and go, and that's what I put a huge emphasis on. Not just like what we've talked on already, when it's hammering down and it's windy and it's really hard to keep going. Keep the head down and push through, because it will pass in time. But on the other side of the coin, when it's sunshine and it's beautiful outside and things are going well, that's an opportunity to capitalize, to really put those things in place, be proactive, start working on healthy habits, on systems, on processes, and putting backstops in place that are going to protect you for when the tough times come, because they will come again. But yeah, having that in place is just invaluable. There was one more thing I was going to add, which was I was actually chatting to a friend yesterday, and we were talking about how, because we've both gone through some pretty tricky periods with our mental health, and it's actually really nice to see in that when we were, this is one of my friends from school, and you touched on what school's like back then. Like it was very much like, you know, you kind of puff your chest out and you have a bit of a swagger, and you kind of are expected to be a bit of a lad, but you know, that wasn't me and that wasn't my pal either. But we did that sort of thing. We never kind of had deeper conversations. It was always chat about like the football or what's happening this weekend and stuff like that. Whereas now we're at a point where we're both in our 30s now, and we're able to have much more in-depth conversations. And when we were chatting last night, we both were saying how like we wouldn't necessarily change the difficult experiences that we've gone through, because although at the time it was brutal and like you wouldn't want to revisit that, it has helped us kind of develop the mental tools and skills, and we've got insight that we just simply would not have had we not gone through those tough periods. And I'm sure that's probably the same with you as well.
Yeah, 100%, mate. Yeah, weirdly, I wouldn't change it. You know, there's certain aspects that I'd change about it, you know, of course. And, you know, I'd love it if I could be where I am now without it having happened, right? But, yeah, 100%, man. You can't do that much work on yourself. You can't try so hard to get better without leveling up. You know, you can't, and there's no end to the leveling up. Of course, we're always learning. No one's, you know, not reached enlightenment yet, Chris. You know, but but yeah, you can't do that much work on yourself without leveling up. And I always say I started doing this stuff, this inner work, because I was in crisis and because I had no choice. But now I do it so that I can get the most out of my life. You know, so that I can really like step into me and, you know what it is to authentically be myself and have new experiences and be a good dad and a good husband and a good person. And, you know, and it becomes, you know, it's still hard, but it becomes something you like enjoy, you know, but yeah, you can't, you know, and you know what the beauty of it's really important to draw a line under that, because for a long time I was really, really scared that I would do something and I would go backwards. You know, I was always like, oh, I'm just like one late night away from fucking being mentally ill. And it was just, I was so scared of going back there that I was holding myself back. I wasn't living my life. I wasn't taking any risks. I wasn't taking any chances. I wasn't doing anything bold and brave because I was so worried about getting sick. And, you know, my therapist said to me that you're never going to go back there because you can't unlearn everything that you've learned. Like now that you know it, you can't not know it, you know? So even if there's like bad days or bad weeks, as soon as I felt a bit under the weather, my first thought would be like, oh no, like, oh, this is it now. Like chaos is going to happen again. Like, you know, it's everything, but you can't unlearn what you've learned, you know? And there's a real safety in that, because when things are challenging, when things are tough, it's like, no, I've got this, man. I've had it before and I've had it again, and I've fucking got this. And it might not be nice, it might not be easy, because that's a misconception as well, right? Is that when you kind of figure some of this stuff out, that suddenly life gets really easy. It's not. Life is brutal, man. It's fucking hard and shit's gonna happen. That's it. That's the human experience. It's probably like challenging more often than it's great, really, being a human being. But yeah, you can't unlearn this stuff. So once you've got it in your toolbox, you know, you can really kind of relax a little bit about sinking back into your old ways.
Yeah, totally. That's a really, really helpful perspective. And I get that fear as well. Like, you know, when you've been somewhere like that, it's an understandable worry to be like, well, I don't want to go back there. Like I say, I've absolutely benefited in many ways from having that experience, but do I want to go back to that sort of state of mind and that the challenges that I faced back then? Absolutely not. But yeah, just to know that, you know, I've learned from that, and it's not something that's just going to disappear overnight. It gives you that self-belief that, yeah, you know, even if times do get tough, I'm not going to necessarily slip back to the old way of things, which, yeah, that's definitely a really helpful perspective to keep in mind.
If you don't mind me asking, how are you day to day these days, Chris? How are you now?
Yeah, thanks for asking. No, I'm great, honestly. It's been I've done a episode already about kind of my own story, but just a kind of overview. I kind of struggled with my. It's interesting. I talk about it, struggled for like 6 or 7 years with my mental health, but I think as you've rightly touched on, you realise actually no, this goes way back, way further than that, and probably I was struggling for much longer than just a 6-7 year period. But no, these days I'm much better. I've sounds very similar to you in that I kind of reached a breaking point, and then I eventually started talking to people. As you say, didn't really have the words in those early stages, but began to realise that actually, it's not as scary as it seems, and actually if you can find the right people to talk to, it's super helpful. I realised I wasn't alone. I realised that, I did have the abilities to maybe do something about it, and went to the GP and got some medication for a while, similar to you as well. It kind of just helped to stabilise things out and allow me build me a platform to kind of be proactive, like we touched on, and make changes to life. And yeah, for the last, so I would say it was 2018, I kind of came off medication, and since then, don't get me wrong, like you say, life is tough. Like it's ups and downs, but I've been in a position now where I would say, or right now, I'm the happiest and healthiest I've ever been. So yeah, thanks very much for asking. But yeah,
mate, I love that, man.
Days.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. It's interesting you say, like, when you're like having these struggles over a long period of time as well. I think something that really helped me to find compassion for myself, because for a long time I kind of beat myself up. There's almost like there's two types of recovery that happening at the same time, right? So you're trying to get better from like the illness that you're experiencing, but you also have to recover from the fucking chaos that you cause when you're not well and just bumbling around life, misbehaving, And so the two things are going on at the same time, and the guilt and the shame. And I used to really beat myself up about that. And it was actually my wife that pointed out to me. She was like, yes, you were unwell for a long time, and there's some really difficult things within that, but there are also really good things within that too. We had like, weekends away, we had like a holiday, we had like birthday parties, and you only focus on the times when you felt really bad, or when you had the horrible thoughts, or when you said something you really wish you hadn't said. But it's not like that all the time. In between, there's good moments, and it's very important when we look back at these periods of time not to only focus on the terrible stuff. In all that time I've just talked about, I started my own business and I had another baby. Like these are some of that was beautiful. Do you know what I mean? But I only ever thought about the bad stuff, and like it helped me to find compassion for myself, to go, no, hang on, it wasn't. I'm not just writing off 6 years of my life or whatever. Like there's just moments within that, and there was some nice moments within that too, when we went to the park and played football and had cake on the way home, and it was sound. Like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so you're totally right. It's so easy to hyperfixate on the negative things, and maybe some of the hurt that you caused, and kind of give yourself a hard time. Like when you're falling asleep at night, you don't necessarily, your mind doesn't go back to like playing football or eating cake. It goes back to those what you might term as like fuck ups and mistakes and embarrassments and stuff like that. But yeah, and with that in mind, as you say, it's so easy to forget that, yeah, there were a lot of good things that were happening in life as well. I don't know about you, but for me, a challenge I face in that is during that sort of, I would say 6-7 year period, my memories from it are actually really quite faded. Like I struggle to remember not just the good stuff, but the negative stuff too. It's all a bit of a blur, to be honest. But yeah, that doesn't take away from your point. It's absolutely, it is really important. And I like when we talk about compassion, I'm always quite careful, because I know that for me, again, when I think about old me, compassion, I would have been like, oh no, that's like a soft feminine thing. And it's not something for me. But also, and it's also, I remember I was chatting to a client I worked with years ago about compassion, and their responses was like, well, that's just letting yourself off the hook. And I was like, oh yeah, that is how I would have seen compassion as well. It's like you're just letting yourself off the hook for things that you may have done wrong, or the hurt you've caused and that sort of thing. But it's not necessarily that. It is just reframing things and thinking about, well, actually there's a reason why I was struggling in that way. I think the way you phrased it was like, what's happened to you. So instead of it being like a personal flaw, like it's actually there was a reason for those struggles. There was a reason for those behaviours. Of course, you need to take accountability for any of those, any harm or anything that may have happened as a result of that. But it just allows you to look back more with that compassion, through that compassionate lens, rather than being so hard on yourself and beating yourself up constantly, potentially for the rest of your life as well.
Yeah, definitely, man. I'm a firm believer, we can only change the world from a place of compassion. That's where it starts and ends for me. And, you have to find compassion for yourself before you can find it for other people. I believe that too. When I had no compassion for myself, when I had no self-esteem, no self-love, when I really did think that I was just a worthless person, and I projected that out all the time. I'd get really cross in the car. I'd be short-tempered when, oh God, someone in the queue in front of me that's taking ages. Just one of those people that just went through life with that. I had no compassion for anyone because I didn't have it for myself. And in learning to build it for myself, then I learned it to have for other people. But if there's no people, like road rage, man, everyone's just getting so angry in the cars and stuff, and you just think no one's setting out thinking, oh, can't wait to cut a few people up today and make Chris stall at the roundabout. No one's setting off from that. And if if someone does do something that you think is a little bit daft, maybe they're coming back from a really hard visit in at the hospital, maybe they're going through something, and if we don't have that compassion, it's a lot easier actually to live life with that mindset, because you can just let things go, and I do think once we find it for ourselves, we can find it for others, and that's how we change the world. You got to have compassion for everyone. Is just doing the best they can with what they've got, and I'm very lucky that I've been able to create more. So when I do the best I can, I have more to reach into, right? But some people don't have that, for whatever reason. A lot of those reasons are probably not their fault, and some of them maybe will be their fault. But if everyone's doing the best they can with what they've got, and we can find compassion for that, then we can make big changes. The world would be very different if we all kind of started giving a shit about each other. It would change fast, I think.
Oh, totally. And I'm again very similar in that sense that kind of cultivating a sense of self-compassion has allowed me just to take more perspective when it comes to other people, and understanding, instead of taking them on face value, whether it is someone cutting me off, or whether it is maybe a friend saying something that I think, oh, that was a bit unkind or whatever, instead of just taking it as face value as, oh, they're just being an arsehole or a prick, or they're just that's just the way they are, it's actually just allowed me to realise I don't necessarily understand what's going on with this individual. It's not just a cut and dry case of they're being difficult. There might be things that I don't know that are going on with them, or past experiences, or when I think then about my old self, I could maybe think about, well, there were behaviours that I was participating in that I didn't really understand myself. So maybe they're not even aware of the fact that what they've said or what they've done is actually quite hurtful. And it just allows you to respond a lot more gently and kindly. And again, maybe these aren't particularly masculine things, unfortunately, but as you say, it just makes such a difference to life, and not just the life of others, but your own life as well.
Having that kindness for yourself, right? The person you were speaking to said it's letting yourself off the hook. Then I'd be curious as to why are they so keen to be on the hook, right? That it doesn't sound nice being on a hook. And rather than look back and beat yourself up for decisions you've made, just realizing that we're all human, we're all flawed, we all make mistakes. And if you acknowledge that with compassion, then maybe you won't do it again next time. Maybe you won't repeat that behavior. Whereas if you beat yourself up for it, or pretend that you made the right decision when deep down you didn't, then you're more likely to do it again. So it's why do you want to be on a hook for, man? What's going on there?
Yeah, that's a better question to ask. Definitely, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for your thoughts on that. Just one final question, and we'll wrap things up there. But thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing to chat to you, and such a good conversation. So the question is, and this is what I finish every interview with, and it's a tough one. What one word would you use to describe a strong man, and why?
That is a tough question, and my first thought was to go in with something quite obvious, vulnerable or something like that. I'd imagine that a lot of people say that. So I wanted to kind of scratch into that a little bit more, because we throw words around like vulnerability and masculinity, but these are just blanket terms for things. What does it even mean? They mean different things to different people, right? Vulnerability means different things to different people. And I don't know, something that really comes through for me, for a strong man, is the word gentle. How we can lean into that side of us. How can you be gentle, and care about the people that you need to care about, and care about yourself, and embrace these other parts of yourself. You know, I think a strong man is a gentle man, or maybe curious. That's coming, you know, like being curious, you know, like leaning into things, approaching the world with curious eyes, you know. And I think if we do that, we can still step up to challenges, and we can still do the, you know, quote unquote masculine things we need to. But, you know, maybe, yeah, gentleness, curiosity. I know that's not a very, I'd love to have had a soundbite for you, Chris, but but that's where we are. When I kind of think of like masculinity, right? So I'm more than happy to talk about sexual identity or gender identity on like a scale, right? This fluidity to it, that makes sense to me. I get that, right? I think that's a really beautiful thing. And I think we can apply the same to masculinity. It's like it's just a scale, and there'll be times in your life when you need to be at one end, when we do need to kind of lean into that more stereotypical, whether that's with a little bit of aggression or a little bit of anger, or, you know, that sort of like protector side. And there'll be other times, you know, when we need to be down the other end of that scale. You know, when I'm with my kids, I don't want that energy. You know, when I'm playing with the kids, when we're doing jigsaws, when we're running around in the park, that's when I want the playful, the softer, the more gentle, curious side of me. But if we were driving home and there was a situation where, you know, maybe something bad could happen, then I'd need to lean into that other energy. So I think sometimes it's not about switching something off and being something else. It's not about changing it. It's about being able to like lean in to all sides of it when it's most healthy. If you take the more aggressive, the stronger stereotypes around masculinity and try and plug them into the gentle end, they won't fit, and then it's going to look toxic, you know. But at the same time, there is types, you know, like we can't pretend that life is safe. You know, if you're walking down the street and something happens, maybe you need to lean into that other side of it. So that's kind of like helped me to understand my own experience of what I think masculinity is, and what makes a strong man is being able to kind of like, just be fluid with it, you know, be strong when you need to be strong, and be gentle when you need to be gentle, and like most of the time, probably somewhere in between, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I guess, where that curiosity comes in, when you're approaching situations, and it can allow you to take that sort of non-rigid approach to masculinity. Because I know myself, and that, you know, we've referred back to like the versions of us that were kind of in this sort of specific headspace, and I did believe that, you know, to be a man, that it was this rigid box and that I had to fit myself into, even though I knew kind of the authentic me that didn't really fit into that box, but I had to do it anyway. But just taking that perspective of, it's a sliding scale. Like we can tap into different elements of masculinity, and to be honest, there's not really any sort of characteristics that are excluded from being masculine. Then it just allows you to respond more appropriately to situations, instead of forcing something that doesn't fit and potentially could either cause hurt to you or to other people.
Yeah, man. If all you've got is a hammer, then everything's a nail, right? That's
yeah, definitely. I like it. Well, Tom, honestly, thanks so much. I've really, really enjoyed chatting to you, and the conversation's been brilliant. I'm sure we could have gone on a lot longer, but I'll maybe have to get you on another time in the future. Before we wrap things up, can you just give people an idea of where they can find you, your podcast, any social links and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. So, on all the usual podcast places, wherever you're listening to this, you'll be able to find Proper Mental. My website is propermentalpodcast.com. I'm on all the usual socials. I'm not huge on social media. I'd rather not be there, to be honest. But you can find me. That was a really unenergetic sales pitch, wasn't it? But yeah, usually Instagram. If I'm anywhere, I'll be knocking around on Instagram. So yeah, you can catch me there. Proper Mental Podcast. Amazing, Tom. Honestly, thanks so much, and take care of yourself. Thank you, Chris. A real pleasure. It's great to chat today, mate.